What if it's not over there? What if you're not just the physical creator of something over there? What if you're the actual creator of exactly your experience?
So thank you all for coming this evening, and I am honored to be here from Los Angeles to have a conversation. It's really a conversation between George Merck and Hap Tivey, and I'm just the ancillary, the person who needles them when they need needling. But just as a little bit of background, obviously you all just saw this video about Hap Tivey's work, and I imagine many of you are familiar with the work, but maybe not all of you. Hap has focused on phenomenological experiences in his work since he began making art in the late 1960s, pursuing, in his words, the concrete experience of light as well as the emotional and theoretical implications it holds for the human condition. Over the years, he has made paintings and sculptures, as well as the experiential installations that we saw in the video. He made his earliest light-based works when he was living in Los Angeles, one of a number of artists working in Southern California at that time, including James Turrell and Doug Wheeler, who were mentioned in the film, whose art investigates the perceptual phenomena of light and space. Informed by his deep technical expertise, and we'll get into that later in the evening, as well as his many years of practicing Zen, Hap's work continues to address similar concerns in new ways. It's been exhibited across the United States and abroad, and is included in numerous public collections, including MoMA, the Guggenheim, LACMA, I'm very happy to say, and the Buffalo AKG Art Museum, who I think is nicely represented here tonight, and others. So it's really great to be here with Hap. And then collector and philanthropist George Merck is the founder of GMAC, which is a nonprofit space with a collection located in Palm Beach in Florida. With over 100 works of art, it is one of the most important collections of light and space in the southeastern United States, and I might hazard perhaps across the entire country or the world. And its mission is to share these works with South Florida audiences through their exhibition program. In addition to his role as a collector, George is an active patron and donor and has been instrumental in increasing engagement by a younger generation of philanthropists, which is truly important and exceptional. So thank you for that. He currently chairs the board of the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C. He is the youngest trustee and the youngest board chair in their history, and he also serves on the board of the Norton Museum of Art in Palm Beach, again, the youngest trustee in their history. Additionally, he actively participates in the National Gallery of Art's Collectors Committee and is on the leadership committee for the Smithsonian campaign. So we have an extraordinary artist and an extraordinary collector and patron here tonight, and I think we'll have a really interesting conversation to hear from them. So I want to start out by asking each of you to talk for just a few minutes, and I'm going to highlight that for you, Hap, to talk about how you will see that Hap is one of the world's great raconteurs. Ask about how you came to be interested in light, Hap as an artist, and George, you as a patron, and as a collector. So Hap, let's start with you. How did that interest start?
I think I have to hold this in a very particular situation. Is this working for everybody? I'm told I have to have the right angle. But I think most artists that I've met, with very few exceptions, if they honestly say how they were initially interested in something, it's because they saw something that another artist did. And in my case, as an undergrad at Pomona College, it was close enough to LA and far enough from LA that a light artist in LA was brand new, very exciting, and at the same time, godly, because they were out of reach. So when I was a youngster, I say that as a 20-year-old, because I feel like that's a youngster relative to me now. But as a youngster, I would look at what was happening, and I thought, this is really insightful. This is so much better than this painting I'm doing trying to imitate Morris Louis. I'm going to try and do something with light. And when I graduated, I was confronted basically with the Vietnam War, which I left because I intended to be a conscientious objector. I went to my draft board. They admitted that that would be all right with them. I volunteered to be drafted. I was, and I worked in a hospital for the next 3 years. Fortunately, I was in the desert. I was very engaged with what I knew about Terrell and Wheeler in particular. And in the desert, I would make my own art with sand dunes and sunsets. I'd literally climb some 70 or 100-foot sand dune and articulate it by moving in it. And then I'd go to the next sand dune and sit and watch the sunset. And these were monumental light works for me. But I want to make a very, very clear distinction between what I'm doing now and what that was about. In my mind at that time, I was training to get ready to become a monk, and I'd done a lot of sitting and a lot of training, and during that time in the desert, I sat alone for days and days at a time. But sitting and watching a sand dune over there change color because the light from the sun was being bent by the atmosphere of the earth was something that I could understand cosmologically, but it was still something over there. I was over here. What we're trying to do now in this evolution of how it started, what we're trying to talk about now is, what if it's not over there? What if you're not just the physical creator of something over there? What if you're the actual creator of exactly your experience? Without any doubt, that thing which you are processing visually, consciously, that is you. It's not an object in the objective universe over there somewhere. You're it. That's what we're trying to get to in this new kind of light. And some of you may have been into a Terrell or Wheeler installation where there's a vast infinite light. Where there's a vast infinite light. Infinite light deserves loud. And you've had this sense of being lost in that light. That's something which was important, and I mean, they've done hundreds of these. And people are gathering this around the world. But to be in that circumstance of having your perception become infinite is something that you can only address as that's yourself. I'm going to stop there.
I'll pick up there.
Perfect.
I think that was a fantastic explanation. I have to say, I grew up in South Florida, so a little bit different than Hap's, engagement with Southern California, the light and space movement that came out of Ferris Gallery. But the concept of the natural world inspiring you, just as he mentioned Helen Pashkin. Helen Pashkin was inspired by drifting her fingers through tidal pools, watching sunbeams drift over the sand and change. I think there's a natural element and a phenomenon that we want to engage with. It's calming, it's dynamic, it's complicated, and it's extremely simple all at once. How is that possible? Ask Hap. And obviously I don't talk as much as Hap does.
So George, tell us a little bit about how you became interested in collecting and exhibiting this work, because you've really focused on it in a very substantial and specific way, and that's, it's not like every collector in South Florida is doing that.
They should. They should come to me. No, honestly, it was this really strange moment where I found a new medium. I had been exposed to it when I went to Southern Methodist in Dallas, Texas. So I knew about light and space, I knew about James Turrell, I knew about Bob Irwin and the broad strokes of it all. But when it came down to the nitty-gritty, guys like Hap, Peter Alexander, Helen Pashkin, the ones who were really following this ethos, it was completely different and something I had to kind of explore on my own. And honestly, it just was, I found a nostalgic root in something that was brand new, which I know sounds like an oxymoron. How can you have nostalgia in something you've never known? Well, all these guys out in La Cienega Boulevard and Venice Beach were creating light and space works, either using polyesters and plexis that I'm familiar with for surfing and fishing, or they were using light And that's what we're exposed to all the time on the beach in Florida. So when I first moved up to New York, I have to admit, or was first exposed to, the movements, the isms, we all know the isms, you feel a little removed when you're like, oh, I wasn't cultured in that way. I don't understand what their approach was. There was no need for explanation for light and space, and I think that was the immediate draw. I understand it more now. I didn't completely understand it at the time, but there is an immediate draw.
Hap, you mentioned that you went off to Japan. You packed it all in and went to Japan to live in a Buddhist monastery. Can you tell us a little bit about your interest in and your practice of Buddhism and how that relates to your art practice?
I always think that I can speak so loud that I don't need a microphone, and it's a little odd for me to have the microphone. I keep wondering what this thing is that's in my hand. And that's something I do with a lot of the things that I do in my life. I just wonder what this is. And sometime back in the young days, I read D.T. Suzuki's Zen and Japanese Culture, and I began wondering what this is. And fortunately, one of the things that happened in Claremont, California, was that the first Zen Roshi, that is, the first Zen master to ever come from the Rinzai sect of Zen Buddhism and live and teach in the United States, came to Los Angeles. And he came to Claremont. And he began a group of people who would seriously look at what this process was. And then some years
Just
later...
to interrupt, for those of you who may not know, Claremont is where Pomona College is.
Pomona College is that old college on the West Coast, surrounded by some other younger colleges that are called the Claremont Colleges. But in any case, the Claremont graduate program has a divinity school, and they brought not just this particular abbot from the Myoshinji Monastery in Kyoto, they brought a second. And that man, Roshi Shibayama, had a young monk with him who was training to become his successor. The young monk Gensho and I became very, very close friends. And eventually, after sitting through years of working in the hospital alone in the desert and living in a truck, incidentally, the happiest years of my life were being homeless. And then going to Gensho on weekends, training with him, until finally it became time for me to be able to go back to graduate school and try some art life again. And eventually he said, if you want to come to the monastery, come. So at the point where I finished the Pasadena studio, which was this first infinite light space, which, if you can imagine an egg that's 18 feet long and 8 feet in diameter and has a perfect surface, and there's a platform cantilevered out into it. I think there's one person here in the room that might have been on that platform. And surrounded by light, which is absolutely infinite. But at times, it's like looking into a sky with no depth, or it's like looking into a sky with infinite depth, or it's like looking at the viscous light in the humor of your own eye. That's what happens in an infinite ganzfeld. Now that was actually the whole surround. George and I are not making the whole thing, but we're trying to make the experience with a different version of that.
Scale can be an issue.
Scale can be an issue.
If we had a warehouse, we would create
or a bigger
warehouse.
Door.
Or a bigger door.
But in any case, what happened was basically I ran out of money. I had a truck that I'd been living in. I sold the truck for a one-way ticket to Japan, and I went. And during that time, as a monk, and it was a fair amount of time, I observed that a lot of the monastery was being remade by these carpenters who had planes that were literally 8 inches wide. Now, I don't know if any of you do any carpentry, but it's pretty tough to find a hand-driven plane that's 8 inches wide. But that's how wide the boards are that are in the Engawa, that track around underneath the roof of the temples and the monasteries. That wood is made with these. And those planes plane the entire piece of wood perfectly like a piece of paper. So I collected them. And as a monk, you get about 20 minutes of free time a day. So I had a pen, and I started making drawings. And after the first year, I was offered 3 shows back in LA and a place to live and a romance reasserting itself. And, you know, you struggle through a lot of that Zen stuff, and it's pretty physically tough, so it'd be good to take a break. So I came back and did shows in LA, and that's where light really began to take hold of me, because through every artist benefits by some kind of benefactor. Every artist. Doesn't matter what your background is. And any benefactor who can say to you, please go ahead and build it. It's like momentarily this flow of relief comes into your life where you can think about what you are doing and not how you can afford to do it. I can't say enough for curators and benefactors. That comes from every ounce of me. Because without them, none of us would be doing this. Terrell wouldn't be doing this. Wheeler wouldn't be doing this. Irwin wouldn't have been doing this. People stepped up for every one of them. And fortunately, somebody, a grandmother of someone here in the audience, stepped up for me. I used to be able to walk out of my studio in Pasadena, walk 6 blocks, and open a refrigerator and go swimming in a swimming pool. That kind of thing keeps you alive, and it keeps you making art. It's not magic, it's practical. The pragmatism of being an artist is so essential. And people all along my way, Carol, George, and many, many others, were made it possible. So when I came back from Zen, what I brought with me was this desire to give somebody else that sense of no self and infinite being, of recognizing something so simple, something which is at the basis of everyone's existence. Think of it this way. Every single cell in our body, every cell in your body right now has an electric potential charge. Everything that you think, everything that you feel, every way that you move is the function of electricity. From the standpoint of a biophysicist, you are essentially an electrical field. Every thought, every motion, every perception, every self-conscious reality is an electrical function. That's a foundation that is immaterial as far as we can tell. And there is a kind of recognition of ourselves that we have an immaterial foundation upon which this amazing corporeal miracle is built. So from one point of view, art reflects everybody. We can walk to a Madonna suffering the death of her child, and we can feel that pain. We can feel that as our own pain if we, unfortunately, have had that experience. And we can look at a beautiful horse and think of an example of ourselves and a beautiful horse, right? We can project ourselves into any kind of art. You can go to the Leon Gottlieb show, which is opening tonight at Hauser and Wirth, which I recommend going to, and you can experience an artist giving you the sensation of terror, horror, fear, misery, the darkest things in humanity. But what you can do with light is you can go through this kind of curious portal of beauty, not to be dismissive of pretty, but beauty as a rewarding experience that you yourself are creating. There's no one else there creating it for you. I'm not there. Those LED lights aren't doing it for you. It's taking place within the very essence of yourself. And if you get to that point where you reflect on that, and you reflect on that fundamental basis, it's a wondrous kind of art experience. that's kind of, I'm going to stop now.
I think I like quotes. I like to summarize things really succinctly, and I think the concept of art is supposed to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. That's exactly what you were touching on right there. There's this unbelievably pragmatic approach to Hap's artwork and his practice, but when you look at the pieces, we all just saw the video, they are completely ethereal. I mean, it's overwhelmingly unexplainable, but actually it's not. It's a science. It's really thought out. It's unbelievably, premeditated, and I don't mean to use that word incorrectly because I know, okay. It's just amazing to me because I have been to quite a few ganzfeld rooms, and this is a whole different experience where we've chatted about this, Hap and I. I'm sure some of us out here have Aura rings or similar tracking devices, whether it's an Apple Watch or a Whoop band. When I have mine on all the time, and when I sit in front of Hap's Helios work that's at GMAC right now, GMAC is fine.
Okay,
No, it's okay.
GMAC. I
It's
stand
okay.
corrected.
It just rolls off the tongue. But my heart rate actually physically goes down, and it's documented over weeks. Consistently sitting in front of a light cycle that was structurally sound to calm you down and give you a sense of serenity is you cannot understate the importance or the impression that you will get when you sit in front of one of these works. So everyone better be flying to Florida.
So, George, tell us how you first learned about Hap's work, and then how the commission that you're working on, this ganzfeld experience, how that evolved. And also, I'm curious if this is the first commissioned work in your collection.
This is not the first commissioned work. I'll start with your first question. I was introduced to Hap's work through Jan Butterfield's Light and Space, classic 1976 novel, or it's not a novel, it's
Catalog.
a study element, but monograph catalog. And I thought, why isn't anyone hitting him up? Why is no one talking about Hap? I mean, the photographs are there, the explanation behind the intention of the work, how complicated it was, how demanding it was. I mean, everything was in place, and I just didn't understand why Hap wasn't being, talked about more often, especially at the time. There was a lot of light and space that was kind of being put to the forefront, maybe not for the best reasons. I don't know if everyone saw Kendall Jenner's Arc Digest of James Turrell. Kind of made me cringe. But, I just thought, well, if light and space is finally getting the attention it deserves, then the major players that really, laid the foundation, the bricks, and the cornerstones, the way Hap did, need to be revered. And it took a few years. We chatted about a couple of projects. We actually thought about doing an installation work on the ceiling, which that might come up in the future. We never know. We went through a lot of iterations. We always say sometimes it's best to let things happen when they happen. We kept trying to plan out a show, kept trying to figure out how to work together, and now we are. So it took just patience, which I think Hap's works really help you attain.
And my understanding is that this commissioned work is similar to the piece that was described in
Yes.
the videos.
The circular, it's ENSO. That's the body of work that Hap creates, that are those circles that kind of envelop your entire body. They eliminate the ganzfeld phenomenons, eliminating all sense of depth in the room by eliminating curvature or hard angles. So you think you are in, as he said, it could be a mile long. You never know. Or it could be just on the wall as a relief. It's mesmerizing. And honestly, right now in South Florida, it's very similar to the community that existed in Venice Beach just after the Ferris Gallery, that you came up in Hap with all these guys like Ron Cooper and Laddie John Dill and Peter Alexander, and everyone is kind of referencing the light and beach culture, and not trying to push it out, but not only letting it in, using it as the most important element in the work. There is no paint or pigment in Hap's work. It's light, which is interesting as a tangible object. Can't grab it.
So Hap, your work, certainly the current work, but even throughout your career, your work has required pretty significant technical and technological expertise. So can you tell us a little bit about how you acquired the knowledge to be able to work with these now very sophisticated computers and programming, and how do you keep up with constantly changing technology?
Get your angle right, Hap. But I think I have to confess that I don't keep up any longer. And I can't speak to you in any real way about AI, except I'm scared to hell of it. The issues of technology, when I started doing things that were truly technological, as opposed to building it with some fluorescent tubes and a lot of structure, began with, I imagine, Windows 3.1 and Photoshop 2.0. And at that time, I began understanding something about the more sophisticated light that was being developed, specifically LEDs. And I began to realize that there would be a way that making light could be much more a composed issue. When people came to see the installation, that infinite room that I'm referring to as an 18-foot long egg, 8 feet in diameter, floating out in the middle of it, that had compositions. And those compositions were actually written down like a John Cage score. There are prints with those scores on them. And I once sent you one. And the point of this is that back at the very beginning, 74, 75, when I was trying to get this started, I had this sense that if you can compose the changes that light can go through, specifically in a room, in a circumstance which does not permit enough information for your brain to figure it out. That's the whole deal. Can I do a little bit of biophysics here for a moment? Can we do some like mechanical thinking stuff? Okay, simple fact, sort of. If you read the book Incognito, you'll discover that the author of Incognito, Eliel, says to you straight out, 1/3 of your neurology is dedicated to vision. 1/3. Now, what happens in that 1/3 is something completely different. What happens in that 1/3 is you're collecting data. That data is being captured by 3, or in the amazing 18% of women who have 4, which I am incredibly jealous of. They can see colors that I can't even imagine exist. But those RGB elements in your eye are gathering that raw data and converting it to an electric pulse. That electric pulse is being switched through different channels and sent essentially by your optic nerve to your visual cortex. Your visual cortex has an enormous history of what the objective world can be because it knows what it's looked like, because you've created it since you were an infant. So it then sends that information to something called the thalamus. The thalamus is kind of like a direction. It's like somebody sending traffic in different directions around your brain. So that is going to get this piece of data with an estimate of what it is from your visual cortex. And what comes back to your visual cortex is the thalamus saying, nah, you didn't get that data, that's an error. So then your visual cortex, and this is all happening in amounts of time that we think of like the speed of light, but it's not, it's of course less. But it's very, very fast. So your visual cortex sends back another interpretation of it. And it's accepted or rejected or modified because this time this thalamus is throwing that information at things that interpret vision as threat, pleasure, fear, horror, reward. And that emotional stuff is now getting mixed into it. Now think just simply about the Necker cube that you've all seen if you saw this cube-like thing reverse itself. First you see the front side, then you see the back side. Or if you've done YouTube enough and you've seen the ballerina turn in one direction and then turn in the other direction. These are things where your visual cortex is making a mistake according to the parts of your memory that it's comparing itself to. So it makes this mistake, and then it changes, and it prescribes something else. Well, if the cube didn't go that way, it must go this way. Or if the ballerina goes that way and the information's wrong, it must go this way. But when you're looking into an infinite space, there's almost no information. There's color, there's space, light in space. But your cortex is trying to determine what is the space, but there's no edge. So there is no objective universe. It can compute the color, but the color is something which is rapidly decaying and changing on your own retina. If you give somebody 1 minute of bright green fluorescent light, the chances are it will begin to turn white and gradually go through a kind of pink phase because it's exhausting all those cells that absorb the wavelengths of red. And when they're exhausted, it's not sending a signal that's red, it's sending something else. So here's something that happened in the Pasadena Infinite Light Space. And this is something which is an example, an actual example, it's in the diary, of something that happens that's all those things going on together. I bring this young woman in, she's a nurse. She's a friend of mine, I've never met her before. She sits down on the platform. She's sitting about this far off the surface of the egg.
Oh no.
And she's sitting on a platform cantilevered out into the space, and everything around her is infinite. And the doorway has 2 fluorescent bulbs in it which are behind her. They're green fluorescent bulbs, the strongest of the fluorescent colors. And they both turn on, full blast. And suddenly she's in a sky of infinite green, infinite green. It's below her, it's on every side of her, and she's calm. And it lasts in this composition for about a minute. And in about a minute, it begins to fade because all of her red receptors in her retina are going through an isomorphic transformation which say, I can't give up an electron anymore, I've spent my energy. They're going to try to morph back to a higher energy state, but they can't send a red signal. Your retina is not getting red anymore. So she's sitting there in this, and her whole environment is becoming white, like an atmosphere of fog. And then, in the composition, the light changes to 5 watts of magenta, which is underneath her platform, and gives her maybe half a watt of light. And magenta is what should have been happening with her retina, but it wasn't. So it's almost as if all of this space, and this is coming from her visual cortex, all of the visual space is collapsing into her own head. When I saw this, when I created this, when I saw this the first time, it was really like I was looking at the vitreous humor of my own eye. Like you're in this viscous light, like jello, and it's dark, and it's red, and she screamed. And I mean screamed. I jumped up. I'm doing this composition essentially underneath her. And I come running out, and I bang my head getting out of the little crawl space, and I come running up thinking that she's fallen off of the edge. Or worse, jumped and broken it. And I run to the door, and I say, "Are you all right?" She's sitting there. And she turns around, streaming tears. And I'm saying, what happened? Are you all right? And she said, yes. And I said, do you want to leave? You can come out into the garden, we can sit down. No, we. And so I go, well, I'm going to go on then. So I go on, and I start again. And we go through the green, and we can continue through the 8 or 10 minutes of this composition. We go out into the garden afterwards, and I serve her some tea. We're sitting under this fabulous silk floss tree, which drops orchid-like flowers continuously on us. It's like 150 years old. It's been in Pasadena since the Green Hotel. So then she says, as I ask her what happened, when I was 3 years old, my mother would, I'm going to start crying. I got to get this back again. When I was 3 years old, my mother and I would go to my bed, and every night I would say my prayer. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take, and that would take me to heaven. And then my mother would go, and I would go to sleep. But I was always ponder what was heaven? What happened if I died before I awake? I would go to heaven. And my conclusion at age 3 was an infinitely green space. When she saw it fade, she got progressively anxious and sorrowful, and that whole coagulation of family memory, childhood memory, was suddenly there. She had created all of that. I didn't do any of it. I'm down there with like some little switches that are like fluorescent off, the magenta on.
But that's
what
the
I'm doing.
sensation, right? That people feel in front of Rothkos that's been documented, bringing them to tears, communicating the pure human emotions, ecstasy, doom, joy,
Absolutely.
death. And it's when you see it, it's indescribable. So to reference back to the original question, I think we can all understand the technical ability and the intelligence that Hap has. I mean, that's, I think, another element to light and space. Light and space is obviously a contemporary form of light or of art. I would just call it light, but it's also minimalistic because most of them are one color at a time. They're monochromatic or they change slowly. But my God, there's so much more than that. They're the most complicated pieces. You think they're simple and they're so dynamic, and I think that's really, it takes so much labor and so much physical understanding of the concept. You can't just get in there and throw together a ganzfeld room. You have to understand how your retinas respond to the color red. For anyone out there, there's a great book called The Secret Life of Colors. I don't know if Hap's read it, but he should. Colors change everything for humans. We're born colorblind, if you didn't know that. First color we see is red. That's why it's associated with everything passionate. Could be death, blood, a lot of anger, passion, love, a lot of, it's always very emotional. Blue is one of the only colors that the retina responds to, even in the blind. Joan Moreau said, I see nothing but blue. It's known to calm those that can't even see it. So I think that speaks to Hap's practice. Hap's able to create an effect without intention. You have to be there. You have to be able and willing to accept it and change yourself.
This is a very good statement of why we're talking about perception as the medium. Because if we say that our medium is light, we're in the arena of every architect lighting the top of a skyscraper. And it's not to take anything away from that. That's marvelous as it is. Someone once came to me when I was first starting out in New York and said, we could probably light the top of the Citibank building, that big. And I thought, yeah, but who's going to pay for that? I mean, I'm trying to buy lunch. And I now look out at these cities, or even more amazingly, at the images that come back from space of the Earth lighting up, that we are in light all the time. And what I'm trying to do is not get into another thing that lights up, although I've made plenty of things that light up. I'm trying to compose something that is really about an option of someone's perception wandering in the art, the way that we wander through a Bruegel. Like if somebody comes and looks at one of my pieces and says, oh yeah, I get it, it lights up and it's square, I got it, I'm moving on. And I'm thinking, have you ever looked at a Bruegel like that? If you did you get anything? Did you get anything at all? The point is that we need to make the world. We need to make the world, and most of us do it visually. 1/3 of that stuff is doing this for us. And part of what happens is it objectifies us. It takes away from us the ability to recognize and joyfully embrace the fact that we're virtually nothing at our foundation, but that nothing is what the whole universe comes out of. It's incidentally what that word mu is about in Mushin. It's like, what are you essentially? And if you want to know an essence, it's very helpful to take away all the edges. Just take the edges away. Or if you have to, leave an edge. For what we're building right now that'll be headed for Palm Beach tomorrow, I hope, the edge is simply a circle, and you're in a cylinder. But what's beyond that circle is an undistinguished infinity, which will change space, which will change color, which will change viscosity, which will change what memory you will attach to it when your mind tries to make it part of the objective universe, which you pragmatically must live in. The reason we have a self is because it's the principal thing that we survive with. Ourselves have been around for, I don't know, if you read some people, 6,000 years. And it wasn't that long ago that people were wandering through the world without a sense of a separated self. They were running on reflex. But a separated self can do two things that are amazing. First of all, it can invent time, which means you can predict the future. Think of how important that is to survive. If I can't predict the future, how am I going to get out of this labyrinth of this building, which it took me an hour to figure out how to get to here? But the other thing is that we literally create the objective universe by seeing it, and seeing it is so glorious. Think of the wonderful things you've seen. Our lives are filled with the glory of seeing, and a huge part of that is art. But most of that art is over there. It's a separated object from ourselves. And so if we're dealing with perception as the medium, we can compose the perception to not fixate on objectifying and separating. I mean, if you've ever had an hallucination, it's hard to say it's over there.
Quite subjective. Death of ego? Is that what we're on to right now?
Well, you can probably tell by me sitting up here jabbering away that there's a pretty big ego saying, yeah, keep talking, keep talking.
George, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Or actually a few link questions. Can you share with us how you choose whom and what specific pieces or which artists to add to the GMAC collection? And is getting to know the artist personally something that's important to you as a part of that process? And do you see GMAC as an infinitely expanding collection, or do you have some goals and then you see some kind of closure?
The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one small step, right? That's the classic Eastern saying. So GMAC's current position is its first step. I hope it does grow. I hope Hap and I can create some amazing programming going forward. How do I identify artists and then choose that they're going to be the next acquisition for GMAC? A lot of reading, a lot of literature, a lot of dedication, a lot of study, and then a lot of exposure, trying to get up and see and experience the art, because as much as you read about it, and I will say there are amazing critics out there, Plagans and Buttersfield, there's so many, but I read about Hap's work for 5 years. I actually owned one of Hap's work for 2 years and didn't even get to see it because of the pandemic. It sat in a crate. And I read about it. I knew its dimensions. I knew exactly how long the cyclical colorway that it would go through was, but I did not feel the piece until this last month, where I had it installed and I've been able to sit in front of it for an extended period of time and let it hit me, because I think that's really what it's about. There's always narrative involved in art. That's what I think the Archives of American Art, which, if you're ever wondering, want to dig into what artwork it really means that you're looking at, check out Smithsonian Archives of American Art. Those artists make notes, and they have lots of diaries, as does he. But I will say Light and Space it's just so approachable, but it's also so complicated at the same time, and there's so many individuals that like to kind of fall back in this miasmic, like, I'm so ethereal and cool and you'll never understand. And then Hap's sitting here like, this is exactly why you feel the way you do when you enter that room. There's like this magic component involved with the Turrell, which we all appreciate. Everyone appreciates that. But it's not magic. It's not. It's science. And I have an individual sitting next to me who's known that since day one and knows that when science is perfected, it can become magic. And it is circumstantial, and it's totally subjective. It's not objective. I mean, I think, as you were saying, not everyone screams or cries when they sit in the Ganzfeld room, but I've heard stories like that where people are brought to pure emotion. And I think that when a piece fully moves me, there's no denying that I will make every effort possible to acquire that work, whether it takes numerous years and getting to know the artist, which, yes, that is paramount. If the artist is accessible, if they're still alive and they're active and they're able to meet and have a dialogue, by far that is my number one concern. If not, then my number one concern is that their archival work will remain intact, and everyone that is inspired by them understands exactly their emphasis and their direction.
So I think we'll close with that. I think everyone can see why all of us are in love with Hap and his work. It's truly a remarkable experience, so everybody needs to go down to Palm Beach.
It's happening.
Give them a month or two. But also, for art to get out into the world, it really depends on patrons and collectors.
But Carol, let me thank you. It's you.
Play their role too.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank all of you for coming this evening, and the two of them really get the big thanks. And also, I want to thank Anna and Antonio while they're there. So thank you so much.
Anna and Antonio.